3 weeks after the escape from Whispering Mountain, the silence of the remote village felt like a physical weight. Daniel spent his mornings sharpening tools, Maya organized their supplies in the shed, and Adam documented the local wildlife from the ridge. For 6 days, the air remained undisturbed. No hunters, no shadows, no memories of the mountain. Daniel sat on the porch,
watching the sun dip behind the jagged peaks, and felt the first prickle of unease. The village was too quiet. The birds had stopped singing an hour before dusk, and the wind had died down to a stagnant,
heavy stillness. He stood up, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and scanned the empty trail leading into the valley. Maya emerged from the shed, wiping dust from her hands, and stopped beside him.
She looked at the horizon, her jaw tightening as she caught the same shift in the atmosphere.
Adam joined them, his camera hanging idle at his side. He didn't lift it. He didn't take a shot. They stood in a row, 3 figures against the vast, darkening landscape, waiting for the inevitable.
Then, a figure appeared on the path below, moving with a rhythmic, heavy stride toward their cabin.
The courier did not look up. He stopped at the base of the porch steps, his breathing heavy and ragged, and extended his arms. He held a heavy metal box. Despite the summer heat baking the valley, the surface of the container was coated in a thick, translucent layer of rime ice. Daniel stepped down first,
his hand hovering inches from the cold metal. He could feel the chill radiating off the box, sharp and biting against the humid air.
The courier released the weight abruptly, turned without a word, and vanished back into the shadows of the tree line before Adam could even ask a question. Maya reached out,
her fingertips brushing the frost. She pulled back instantly, a sharp intake of breath escaping her lips. The box pulsed once,
a low, rhythmic vibration that traveled through the floorboards and into their boots. Adam leaned in, his camera forgotten, watching the ice begin to crack and flake away from the surface. Daniel gripped the handle, found it locked, and signaled for the others to follow him inside. They retreated into the cabin, pulling the door shut against the sudden, unnatural drop in temperature. They placed the box on the center table, the heavy silence of the room returning, now anchored by the presence of the freezing object. Daniel placed his palms on the latch. The metal bit into his skin, stinging with frost, yet he held firm. Maya and Adam pressed their weight against his shoulders, leaning into the box as if bracing for an impact. With a sharp, metallic groan, the seal gave way. A faint, rhythmic hum filled the room, vibrating through the table and up their arms. Daniel lifted the lid. Inside, a blue crystal pulsed with an inner light, casting long, shifting shadows against the cabin walls. Adam reached for his camera, but his hand stopped mid-air, drawn instead to a photograph tucked into the foam padding. He pulled it out. It depicted a towering, jagged peak, frozen in time, with a caption scrawled in an ancient, flowing script. The city beneath the endless ice. The blue glow of the crystal intensified, bathing their faces in a cold, electric hue. Maya reached out, her fingers hovering near the light, and the air in the room suddenly warmed. The dread that had defined their last few weeks dissolved, replaced by a sharp, sudden clarity. They were no longer just hiding. They had a destination. Daniel looked at the photograph, then at the pulsating stone, and finally at his companions. The path forward was no longer a question. It was a map. Daniel moved to the corner of the room, pulling a heavy, dust-covered trunk from beneath the bed. He tossed aside old maps and compasses until he reached the leather-bound journals at the bottom. He flipped through pages brittle with age, his eyes darting across handwritten notes that had remained cryptic for years.
Maya held the crystal over the paper, its azure light illuminating faint, pressed ink.
Daniel stopped. He pointed to a sketch in the margin, a geometric pattern identical to the facets of the stone. His grandfather had drawn it decades ago, labeling it as the key to a lost civilization. The ink was faded, yet the instructions were precise. Daniel traced the lines with his thumb, his breathing slowing.
He looked up at Adam and Maya, his expression hardening into resolve.
This was not a random relic. It was a legacy that had waited for him to claim it. He closed the journal with a definitive thud. The transition from survival to pursuit was complete. He packed the crystal and the photograph into his bag,
then secured the journals on top. The cabin felt too small now, the walls closing in on a life that no longer fit.
He walked to the door, opened it to the night air, and waited for the others to follow. The village vanished behind them as the first light hit the horizon. They moved north, away from the familiar, into a landscape of broken stone and rising wind. By the second day, the ground turned unforgiving. Jagged rocks tore at their boots, and the temperature plummeted with every mile they gained. Daniel took the lead, his eyes fixed on the distant, white-capped peaks that loomed like sentinels. Adam followed, his pace rhythmic, his focus locked on the shifting path ahead. Maya brought up the rear, checking the horizon for any sign of pursuit. By midday, a narrow ridge blocked their path. The wind roared against the cliffside, threatening to push them into the abyss below. They linked arms, leaning into the gale, moving inch by inch across the slick, frost-covered shale. One slip would be final. They reached the other side, gasping for breath, their faces numbed by the biting cold. Silence returned, heavy and absolute, as they stepped into the valley floor. The scale of the mountains made them feel microscopic, yet they did not stop. They pushed forward, driven by the weight of the crystal in Daniel's pack and the knowledge that the path back was no longer an option. Every step was a battle against the terrain, but they kept moving toward the north. The valley ended abruptly. Before them, the landscape transformed into a wall of ancient, blue-tinted ice that stretched toward the clouds. The glacier was a colossal, frozen monument, its surface scarred by deep crevasses and jagged ridges that defied navigation. Daniel stopped, his gaze sweeping the expanse, searching for a path. Adam raised his camera, but the sheer vastness rendered the lens useless. The air here held a different quality, thin and metallic.
Vibrating with the weight of centuries of ice, Maya moved toward a sheltered alcove near the base,
her boots crunching on the frozen crust. She paused, then knelt. She cleared a layer of loose powder with her gloved hand.
Her breath hitched, a series of deep, rhythmic imprints pressed into the permafrost human-like, but too long,
and spaced with an unnatural, elongated stride. She stood up, her eyes scanning the white horizon. The tracks did not stop. They led directly into the heart of the ice field, disappearing beneath a massive shelf. She beckoned the others forward.
Daniel looked at the ground, his expression darkening as he recognized the pattern. These were not the prints of an animal.
Nor were they recent. The realization rippled through the group. They were not alone in this wilderness, and the entity that left these marks had been moving with purpose toward the very center of the glacier. They followed the deep, elongated imprints for hours, moving deeper into the shadows cast by the towering ice walls. The sun began to dip behind the jagged horizon, bleeding a bruised purple across the snow. The temperature plummeted.
Turning every exhale into a thick, white cloud, Adam stumbled as the light faded.
The tracks vanishing into a chaotic field of jagged, wind-sculpted ice. They stopped, huddled together against the biting wind,
scanning the expanse for any sign of movement or shelter. Then, the ice beneath their feet seemed to sigh. A faint, rhythmic hum began to vibrate through the frozen ground, rattling the gear in their packs. To their left,
a narrow, jagged fissure in the glacier wall flared with a sudden, brilliant pulse of azure light.
It was not a reflection. It was a beacon. Daniel pulled the metal box from his pack, and the crystal inside began to glow in perfect synchronization with the fissure. The light intensified, casting sharp, dancing shadows against the ice.
He looked at Maya and Adam, his face illuminated by the pulsing blue aura. The search was over.
The entrance was not just a hole in the ice, but a gateway reacting to the relic they carried. They moved toward the glow, the cold forgotten, as the fissure widened to reveal a path carved directly into the heart of the glacier. They stepped through the fissure, leaving the wind and the fading twilight behind. The transition was immediate. The air inside the tunnel felt stagnant, warm, and charged with a low-frequency vibration that rattled their teeth. Walls of translucent, compressed ice curved overhead, shot through with veins of brilliant blue light that pulsed like a slow, steady heartbeat. Daniel led the way, his hand resting on the crystal, which acted as a compass in the dim, shifting glow. The path narrowed, forcing them to turn sideways to squeeze between serrated protrusions of ice that felt like glass against their skin. Every movement was careful. The floor beneath them was uneven, slick with a fine layer of frost. Maya reached out, tracing the glowing blue veins embedded deep within the wall. The ice hummed under her touch, warm to the palm, contradicting the freezing environment. They pushed forward, the tunnel opening suddenly into a vast, vertical shaft. Below them, the blue light deepened, revealing layers of architecture trapped within the glacier, a sprawling, frozen labyrinth stretching down into the earth. Adam took a step back, his eyes fixed on the scale of the descent. It was no longer just a cave. It was an entryway to a world that had been entombed for an eternity. They stood on a ledge of translucent ice, staring down into the dark abyss. The scale of the space was dizzying. Thousands of frozen structures hung in the gloom like jagged teeth. Daniel held the crystal high, its light catching the edges of suspended walkways that looked older than the ice itself.
Then the silence changed. It started as a low-frequency hum that seemed to crawl up from the very center of the glacier.
The sound deepened into a heavy, grinding vibration,
like gears the size of houses shifting in their sockets. Daniel stumbled as the ledge beneath his feet gave a violent tremor.
Maya reached out, catching his arm to keep him from sliding toward the edge. The sound was not natural. It was the distinct, rhythmic groan of metal straining against ice. The walls around them began to pulse with a faster, harsher blue rhythm, reacting to their presence.
Dust and shards of ice showered down from the ceiling as the entire structure groaned in protest. Adam gripped his camera,
but his hands were shaking too hard to focus. The city was not dead. The city was waking up.
And the floor under their feet began to sway with the weight of something massive moving somewhere far below.
The sound hit a deafening, metallic shriek. Beneath Daniel, the floor a seamless slab of ancient, frosted stones snapped like thin glass. A jagged fissure erupted, zigzagging across the platform in a heartbeat. "Jump!" Daniel shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of fracturing ice. He lunged forward, fingers raking across the slick surface as the ground tilted violently. Maya threw herself toward the edge, catching a protruding ice shelf with both hands just as the floor beneath her boots vanished. Adam followed, his momentum carrying him into a frantic roll toward the stable rock wall. Below them, a massive section of the platform buckled and plummeted into the dark abyss. The air filled with a blinding spray of ice dust and debris. They huddled against the unyielding wall, breath hitching in their chests,
watching the abyss swallow the falling structure. The vibration persisted, but the immediate ground beneath them held firm. Silence rushed back into the chamber, heavy and suffocating.
They looked down into the black void where the platform had been, the scale of the drop impossible to measure. They were cut off, stranded on a narrow sliver of ice, with the path forward lost to the depths.
Daniel pressed his back against the wall, his gaze fixed on the empty space where the path had been. The abyss offered no way forward. Then, the air beneath them began to hum a high, melodic chime that cut through the lingering mechanical groans. Wisps of blue light bled from the walls, gathering in the center of the void. Daniel watched as the particles knit together, forming a solid, glowing walkway that stretched across the dark expanse. It was not stone or metal, but a lattice of light that pulsed in time with the crystal in his pack. Maya stepped closer to the edge, her hand hovering over the shimmering surface. It felt solid, dense, with an impossible weight. She pushed her boot forward, and the light rippled like water under her weight, supporting her immediately. They exchanged a look, a silent consensus born of necessity. Daniel led the way, his steps tentative. With every stride, the bridge solidified, casting long, stark shadows against the frozen architecture. They walked into the heart of the void, the cold air biting at their faces, while beneath their feet, the bridge hummed with a rhythm that felt disturbingly alive. They were no longer just moving through the mountain. They were being guided by it. The bridge terminated abruptly against a towering wall of obsidian. Daniel stepped onto the landing, his boots clicking sharply against the cold floor. Before them stood a gate of impossible scale, carved from a single slab of dark stone. 3 statues flanked the entrance, their forms frozen in a permanent state of duty. Each figure held its arms outstretched, palms open to the air. Daniel approached the central statue, his lantern light catching the hollow indentation carved into the stone surface. It was a perfect fit for the compass he carried. Maya moved to the left, tracing the lines of the second statue, her fingers finding a circular depression that matched the dimensions of the blue crystal. Adam scanned the third, finding a narrow, jagged notch that defied simple explanation. He reached into his pack, pulling out the metal box from the village. Inside, tucked beneath the velvet lining, he pried loose a hidden, intricately shaped key. The weight of the silence in the chamber grew heavy. They stood before the gate, the relics in their hands beginning to vibrate in unison with the statues. The path forward was clear, but the mechanism demanded a specific order. They positioned themselves, each holding their piece of the puzzle, and waited for the final signal to act. Daniel pressed the compass into the stone palm. Maya set the crystal into its slot. Adam slid the metal key home. For a heartbeat, the chamber held its breath. Then, the floor shuddered. Deep, resonant groans of shifting tectonic rock echoed through the chamber, vibrating through their very bones. The massive gate did not simply slide, it fractured, the seams splitting with a sound like cracking glaciers. Dust poured from the ceiling as the heavy slabs retracted into the walls. Light pure, piercing, and impossible flooded the space. They stepped forward, squinting against the sudden brilliance. Before them, the mountain gave way to a vast, subterranean expanse. A city of crystalline spires stretched into the dark, frozen distance, illuminated by hundreds of floating blue stars that drifted through the air like living embers. At the center, a golden monolith rose toward the icy ceiling,
casting long, geometric shadows across the frozen streets. Daniel's breath hitched, forming a cloud in the sudden drop in temperature. Maya took a step back, her hand gripping the cold stone of the doorway. It was a silent,
architectural miracle, perfectly preserved in the heart of the glacier. They stood at the precipice, witnessing a civilization that had been missing for eons, their eyes wide as the scale of the discovery finally took hold. They walked onto the main thoroughfare. The ground was smooth, translucent, and cold enough to bite through their boots. Every step echoed, bouncing off the towering spires that reached like jagged teeth toward the ice above.
Daniel reached out to touch a wall. It felt like frozen glass. The blue lights continued their slow,
rhythmic drift overhead, illuminating streets that were perfectly clean, perfectly ordered,
and entirely devoid of life. Maya stopped near a row of dwellings carved directly into the crystalline rock. She stared into a dark window, her voice barely a breath. "There are no people here."
The silence of the city felt thick, pressing against their ears like deep water. Daniel turned to answer, but stopped. In the window Maya had been watching, the darkness shifted. It was not a reflection. A shadow moved fluid, deliberate, and undeniably heavy. He pointed toward a row of windows further down the street. In every pane, the interior gloom seemed to ripple. Something was adjusting its position behind the translucent walls. They were not alone, in this tomb of ice. Adam held his breath, his eyes darting from spire to spire as the air grew colder, and the sensation of being observed turned into a physical weight on their shoulders.
The shadows in the windows did not just move, they coalesced. Daniel took a half step back, his hand instinctively dropping to the pack at his side. Beside him, Adam went rigid, his gaze locked on the highest spire.
Then the blue lights changed. The soft, ambient drift ceased.
Every floating star in the city simultaneously snapped to a piercing, clinical white. They pulsed once, a rhythmic thrum that shook the ground beneath their feet. Then the silence broke. A voice, synthesized and layered with a metallic, grinding resonance, boomed from everywhere at once. It was not human. It was a cold, calculated broadcast that echoed off the frozen walls with absolute authority. Intruders detected.
The words vibrated through the crystalline floor, turning the ice into a conductor for the sound.
Before the echo could even fade, the dwellings around them began to cycle. The frozen panes slid aside with the screech of metal on glass. The city was no longer a tomb. It was a mechanism waking up. Maya grabbed Daniel's arm, her knuckles white. The temperature plummeted, and the blue veins in the walls flared with a violent electric intensity. They were no longer observers. They were targets. The ground erupted. Huge, jagged slabs of ice shattered outward as the Guardians tore themselves from the city walls. They moved with a terrifying, rhythmic thud that cracked the crystalline street with every stride. Daniel didn't wait to see them fully form. He shoved Maya and Adam toward the nearest alley. "Run!" he shouted, his voice swallowed by the deafening grind of stone on ice. They sprinted, their boots sliding on the slick surface as a massive, heavy limb slammed down behind them, pulverizing the ground where they had stood a second before. Shards of frozen debris showered the air like shrapnel. They banked around a corner, the narrow corridor barely wide enough for them to pass. Behind them, the sounds grew louder, a relentless, mechanical pursuit that left no room for error. Adam tripped, his shoulder hitting the wall, but he scrambled up instantly, driven by the tremor of the ground beneath him. The Guardians were closing the distance, their heavy footsteps turning the street into a chaotic ruin. Ahead, a dark, narrow opening appeared between two towering spires. They lunged for it, throwing themselves into the darkness of the passage just as a massive stone fist impacted the entrance, sealing the path behind them in a spray of ice and jagged frost.
The passage opened into a vast, circular chamber that hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration. At its center, a massive sphere glowed with a frantic, flickering light. Maya reached the edge of the dais,
her breath hitching as she observed the ceiling. Cracks webbed across the surface,
spidering outward with every pulse of the sphere. The entire chamber groaned under the weight of the shifting glacier above.
"It is the heart," Maya said, her voice strained against the rising roar of grinding ice.
If it stops, the whole city collapses. Daniel scanned the walls, his eyes darting across the flickering geometry of the room.
Above them, a slab of ice broke free, crashing into the floor with a force that sent them stumbling.
The floor tilted. The hum of the sphere turned into a high-pitched whine,
signaling a total system failure. They scrambled toward a recessed control panel embedded in the far wall.
It was marked with 3 distinct icons: courage, wisdom, and trust. The ceiling shuddered again.
Larger shards raining down. They pressed their hands against the cold surface, desperation driving their movements.
Time was running out as the structure around them began to disintegrate into the abyss. The symbols remained cold. The ceiling groaned, a massive fissure widening directly above them.
Daniel hammered his fist against the panel, but the machine stayed silent.
The high-pitched whine of the core intensified, vibrating through their bones until the air felt heavy and brittle.
Adam pushed past them, his fingers tracing the edges of the console until they caught on a faint, recessed seam. "Look," he said, pointing to a small, final icon hidden beneath the others, 3 figures standing in a line. No hesitation. They reached out at the same time. Daniel, Maya, and Adam pressed their palms firmly against the stone surface. The contact sent a jolt of static through the air.
For a heartbeat, the room went completely black. Then, the sphere pulsed once a deep,
resonant thrum that silenced the grinding ice. The flickering blue light smoothed into a steady,
warm glow that washed over the chamber walls. The ceiling stopped its descent. The cracks froze in place, sealed by a sudden, intense frost. The floor leveled out. Silence returned. Not the tense silence of the hunt, but a quiet that felt ancient and absolute. The city had stopped dying. The sphere retracted into the floor with a soft, hydraulic hiss. In the center of the dais, light bent and converged, coalescing into the translucent figure of an ancient explorer. The projection stood motionless, its features sharp and rhythmic in the blue glow. It gestured toward the group, then spoke in a voice that resonated like grinding stone. The secret has found its guardians. The hologram flickered, its edges blurring into fine particles of light. Before it vanished entirely, a small, faceted crystal materialized in the air, drifting down until it landed in Daniel's palm. It was cold to the touch and pulsed with a faint, rhythmic heartbeat. Daniel watched as the light within the crystal shifted, projecting a 3-dimensional map of the globe onto the chamber wall. A single point of red light blinked steadily, thousands of miles away across an ocean of ice. It was a clear, calculated coordinate. Daniel did not wait. He tucked the crystal into his pack, feeling the weight of the new objective settle against his back. The city stood silent and still, the frozen spires glowing with a renewed, steady blue. They turned from the dais and walked toward the exit, the map now guiding their next step. The trek back through the ice was a blur of shadows and shifting wind. Daniel led, his boots crunching on the frozen debris left by the city's awakening. Maya and Adam followed, their breath hitching in the thinning air as they neared the surface. Light flooded the tunnel, harsh and unfiltered. They scrambled over the final ridge of ice and stepped out into the open. The sun was just breaking the horizon, painting the snow in shades of violet and gold. Behind them, a low rumble shook the ground. The fissure began to groan, the walls of the glacier sliding inward with a sound like grinding tectonic plates. They stepped back, watching as the blue-lit passage folded and sealed, leaving only smooth, unbroken white ice. The city was gone. The silence of the mountain returned, deep and absolute. Daniel shifted the pack on his shoulders, the map crystal pressing against his spine. There was no hesitation. The 3 of them turned together, away from the mountain and toward the distant, uncharted horizon. The cold wind bit at their faces, but they walked forward, their pace steady and rhythmic. The journey was not over. It had only just found its true direction.